Victorian England is often remembered for its strict moral codes, grand architecture, and the dominance of Queen Victoria's influence. But beneath the surface of powdered faces, high collars, and polished shoes, a world of desperation and exploitation festered. In the alleyways behind gas-lit streets and behind the curtains of seemingly ordinary homes, brothels thrived in numbers the authorities couldn't, or wouldn't, control. At the height of the 19th century, London alone was home to an estimated 8,600 prostitutes, many of whom were trapped in a life of violence, disease, and degradation. This is their story. In 1841, a government report estimated that there were around 1,200 brothels operating openly in London. But this was likely a significant undercount. These establishments ranged from dingy, squalid rooms in the slums to luxurious parlors in affluent neighborhoods. Prostitution was not only tolerated, it was profitable. It served the sexual appetites of every class of man, from coal miners to aristocrats. Brothel owners, many of whom were women called madams, managed these establishments with varying degrees of cruelty. Girls were recruited through manipulation or coercion. Orphans, runaways, and impoverished young women were often targeted. Some were kidnapped. Others were promised work as domestic servants, only to find themselves locked in rooms and raped until compliance became survival. The most notorious brothels were strategically located near naval docks, factories, and wealthy districts. Pimps and touts patrolled the streets, luring drunk or lonely men with promises of pleasure. While the transactions were discreet, everyone knew what was happening. Police, politicians, and the upper class often turned a blind eye, or participated directly. The most notorious brothels were strategically located near naval docks, factories, and wealthy districts. Pimps and touts patrolled the streets, luring drunk or lonely men with promises of pleasure. While the transactions were discreet, everyone knew what was happening. Police, politicians, and the upper class often turned a blind eye, or participated directly. The lifespan of a working prostitute in the Victorian era was shockingly brief. Many did not survive past the age of 25. Disease, violence, suicide, and neglect cut their lives short. In one report from the 1860s, a medical officer documented that nearly 30% of the prostitutes he examined had signs of advanced venereal disease. Syphilis and gonorrhea were rampant, spreading rapidly in a time when condoms were made from animal intestines and rarely used. The physical toll was horrific. Untreated syphilis led to disfigurement, blindness, insanity, and painful death. Medical treatments often involved mercury, which caused neurological damage. Many women suffered from uterine infections, pelvic diseases, and complications from illegal abortions. Pain was a constant companion. Mental health was just as brutalized. Suicide was disturbingly common. The shame imposed by society was suffocating, and the women themselves were blamed for their situation. Even those who had been trafficked or abused as children found no sympathy. To the public, they were fallen women, deviants to be pitied, mocked, or ignored. Perhaps the darkest horror of the Victorian brothel system was the trafficking of children. In the late 1800s, it was legal in England for girls as young as 13 to consent to sex. This led to the emergence of a disturbing trade in underage virgins. Wealthy men, often under the guise of seeking purity, paid high prices for girls believed to be untouched. One of the most horrifying exposés came from journalist William Thomas Stead in 1885. The lifespan of a working prostitute in the Victorian era was shockingly brief. Many did not survive past the age of 25. Disease, violence, suicide, and neglect cut their lives short. In one report from the 1860s, a medical officer documented that nearly 30% of the prostitutes he examined had signs of advanced venereal disease. Syphilis and gonorrhea were rampant, spreading rapidly in a time when condoms were made from animal intestines and rarely used. The physical toll was horrific. Untreated syphilis led to disfigurement, blindness, insanity, and painful death. Medical treatments often involved mercury, which caused neurological damage. Many women suffered from uterine infections, pelvic diseases, and complications from illegal abortions. Pain was a constant companion. Mental health was just as brutalized. Suicide was disturbingly common. The shame imposed by society was suffocating, and the women themselves were blamed for their situation. Even those who had been trafficked or abused as children found no sympathy. To the public, they were fallen women, deviants to be pitied, mocked, or ignored. Perhaps the darkest horror of the Victorian brothel system was the trafficking of children. In the late 1800s, it was legal in England for girls as young as 13 to consent to sex. This led to the emergence of a disturbing trade in underage virgins. Wealthy men, often under the guise of seeking purity, paid high prices for girls believed to be untouched. One of the most horrifying exposés came from journalist William Thomas Stead in 1885. Stead, editor of the Pall Mall Gazette, conducted a shocking investigative report titled "The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon." He exposed how easy it was to purchase a 13-year-old girl in London. In one experiment, he arranged for the purchase of a child named Eliza Armstrong. With forged signatures and money, the girl was taken from her home and delivered to a brothel. All of it was done legally, under the laws of the time. The publication caused a public outcry. Parliament was forced to act, and the legal age of consent was raised to 16. But Stead was arrested for abduction, even though the girl was unharmed, and served 3 months in prison. The men who routinely bought underage girls, however, walked free. Not all brothels operated the same. There was a hierarchy even among women in the trade. High-end courtesans, sometimes called kept women, lived in luxury apartments provided by rich patrons. They wore elegant clothes and were educated to entertain powerful men. But these women were rare. Most worked in common brothels, where 10 to 15 women would share a single room in shifts. Beds were often never cold, used around the clock. Hygiene was non-existent. Sheets were rarely changed, and lice and scabies spread easily. Then there were the crib girls, the lowest class, who stood outside dirty hovels in slums like Whitechapel or Seven Dials. Their clients paid mere pennies for sex, often in alleyways or against crumbling brick walls. There was no privacy, no safety. Violence from customers was common and rarely punished. The women often paid rent to the madam, a share to a pimp, and fines for trivial offenses like being late or refusing a client. By the end of the week, many were deeper in debt than they started. Hospitals rarely admitted prostitutes unless they were dying. The most infamous institution for fallen women was the Lock Hospital in London, which treated venereal diseases. Women admitted there were often forced into humiliating inspections by male doctors and students. Some were used as teaching cases, examined, probed, and displayed. The Contagious Diseases Acts, first passed in the 1860s, allowed police to detain suspected prostitutes and force them into medical exams. If they were found to be infected, they could be held in hospitals for months without trial. Men, of course, were not subject to the same scrutiny. Bodies of dead prostitutes were rarely claimed. Many were buried in mass graves or burned anonymously. If they died violently, as many did, the inquest was brief. The assumption was often that they had provoked their attacker or lived a dangerous life. Justice was a luxury they were rarely granted. Victorian society prided itself on strict moral values, modesty, restraint, chastity. Yet, this same society created the conditions that allowed prostitution to thrive. The hypocrisy ran deep. Men of power, judges, clergymen, aristocrats, often publicly condemned prostitution while privately indulging in it. Marriage in the Victorian era offered limited rights for women. Wives were legally subordinate to their husbands. Many marriages were arranged for status or money. If a woman refused sex to her husband, he could force it anyway. Marital rape was not a crime. Women who resisted the constraints of domestic life, who ran away or disobeyed, often found themselves ostracized, destitute, and vulnerable to exploitation. In contrast, men were expected to be sexually experienced. Visiting a brothel was seen by many as a rite of passage for young men. Doctors even encouraged men to relieve their natural urges with prostitutes, while simultaneously warning that these same women were disease carriers and moral threats. This double standard kept women trapped. If a man strayed, it was seen as unfortunate but forgivable. If a woman did, she was ruined. Violence was a common language in Victorian brothels. Physical abuse came from all sides: clients, pimps, madams, and even the police. Many brothel owners used beatings to discipline women who disobeyed. Others resorted to starvation or forced confinement. Pimps often maintained control through terror. They isolated women from any support systems, took their earnings, and used threats to keep them compliant. For many women, the only escape was death, or imprisonment. Customers could be equally brutal. Drunken clients frequently attacked prostitutes, knowing they were unlikely to face consequences. In some cases, women were mutilated. Their stories rarely made the newspapers unless the murder was especially sensational. One such case captured the city's attention in the late 1880s, the murders committed by Jack the Ripper. Between August and November 1888, 5 women were brutally murdered in London's East End. All were poor. All were prostitutes or had turned to sex work for survival. Their names were Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. The killer, known only as Jack the Ripper, disemboweled his victims with surgical precision. The grotesque nature of the murders, throats slashed, organs removed, sparked panic throughout the city. Newspapers printed sensational stories. The case dominated headlines. Yet the women's lives before their deaths were barely acknowledged. They were dismissed as throwaways, unfortunates. The police investigations were hampered by prejudice and incompetence. Officers often overlooked leads or ignored witnesses. Meanwhile, the public became obsessed with the mystery of the killer's identity, not the systemic poverty and abuse that had pushed these women into the streets in the first place. Jack the Ripper was never caught. But his legacy exposed how little society valued the lives of impoverished women. For many prostitutes, pregnancy was inevitable. Contraceptives were expensive, unreliable, or unavailable. Condoms existed but were mostly used by wealthy clients. When a woman became pregnant, she faced 3 choices: keep the child and lose income, give it up, or attempt to end the pregnancy. Illegal abortions were common, and incredibly dangerous. Procedures were performed in backrooms by unqualified individuals using knitting needles, poisons, or blunt force. Women died from hemorrhage, infection, or organ failure. If discovered, they faced arrest. Some women resorted to infanticide. Babies were abandoned in alleyways, left on church steps, or drowned in the Thames. Others were sent to baby farms, a horrifying industry where poor mothers paid women to care for their infants, many of whom were deliberately starved or poisoned. The most notorious of these baby farmers, Amelia Dyer, is believed to have murdered over 200 children before she was caught in 1896. The desperation was not born from evil, but from a society that gave women no way out. While prostitution was technically legal in Victorian England, many of the surrounding activities were not. Soliciting in public, operating a brothel, or living off the earnings of prostitution could all be prosecuted. Yet enforcement was wildly inconsistent. Police often took bribes to protect certain establishments. Madams who paid regularly were allowed to operate without interference. Those who didn't were raided. Women on the streets were more vulnerable. Many were arrested for vague offenses like loitering with intent. A single arrest could brand them for life. Some officers exploited their power further. They coerced sexual favors in exchange for freedom. They beat women who refused. They tipped off brothel owners about impending raids, for a price. The legal system offered little protection. Women were rarely seen as credible witnesses. When they were victims of assault or rape, juries were less likely to convict their attackers. In many cases, the women weren't even allowed to testify. They were labeled as morally corrupt, unworthy of justice. Amid the horror, a few voices tried to help. Christian reformers, feminists, and social workers began campaigning for better treatment of sex workers. Some were sincere. Others were paternalistic and judgmental. One such figure was Josephine Butler, a social reformer who fought tirelessly to repeal the Contagious Diseases Acts. She argued that these laws violated women's rights and dignity. Butler's advocacy made her a target of public scorn. She was called unladylike and immoral. But she never stopped. Reform homes, like the Magdalene asylums, offered women a place to escape prostitution. But these institutions were often harsh, requiring women to confess their sins, cut ties with their past, and submit to strict discipline. Some were forced to work in silence, scrub floors, or sew garments for hours without pay. Rehabilitation was conditional. Women who resisted or relapsed were expelled. Some found salvation. Many did not. Behind the dim lights, velvet drapes, and perfumed bodies was a simple motive: profit. Brothels were businesses, and like any business, they operated on revenue, labor, and exploitation. The madams who ran the brothels were often former prostitutes themselves, hardened by years of survival. Some were cunning businesswomen who knew how to keep the law at bay and the cash flowing. Others were little more than brutal overseers. In either case, they profited from the bodies of other women. Each woman in a brothel was expected to service a certain number of clients per night. The brothel kept a percentage, sometimes as high as 70 to 90%. The rest was often taken by pimps, or used to pay for room and board, clothing, or protection. Many women ended each day owing money rather than earning it. Luxury brothels offered elaborate menus of services. They employed musicians, actors, and even chefs. Wealthy clients were treated like royalty. But even here, the women were not in control. They were dressed, trained, and sometimes drugged to maintain compliance. No one in this system got rich except those at the top. The rest were trapped in a cycle of bodily labor, ever-tightening debt, and brutal survival. The Victorian brothel was not a local phenomenon. It was part of an international trade in women and girls that stretched from Europe to Asia, the Americas to Australia. Human trafficking was not only common, it was organized. Agents, often called white slavers, traveled to rural villages across Europe promising factory jobs, domestic work, or education to young girls. Many families, desperate for any opportunity, allowed their daughters to leave. Once in a city or foreign country, the girls were beaten, raped, and sold to brothels. London, Paris, Amsterdam, and New York became hubs of trafficked women. Jewish, Irish, Italian, and Eastern European girls were especially targeted. Some were shipped to colonial outposts, India, Singapore, South Africa, where British soldiers and traders demanded female company. The trafficking networks were vast and difficult to dismantle. Corruption was rampant. Officials were often paid to look the other way. And when trafficked women were discovered, they were more likely to be arrested than rescued. The moral panic around white slavery eventually drew public attention. But the solutions proposed often punished the victims more than the perpetrators. Drugs played a quiet but critical role in Victorian brothels. Opium, laudanum, and alcohol were not just vices, they were tools of control. Laudanum, a potent mix of alcohol and opium, was widely prescribed for everything from menstrual cramps to depression. Prostitutes used it to dull physical pain and emotional trauma. It helped them endure the demands of dozens of clients per week. But addiction was swift and devastating. Opium dens, often linked to Chinese immigrant communities, were frequented by prostitutes and their clients. The British Empire had fueled the opium trade through its conquests in Asia, and now its cities were saturated with its effects. Some brothel owners deliberately encouraged addiction. A drugged woman was more compliant, less likely to flee, and easier to exploit. Laudanum was cheap and legal. Alcohol was plentiful. The combination left many women physically dependent, mentally shattered, and spiritually numb. By the late 1800s, overdoses became common. Some were accidental. Others were suicides. The line was often blurred. Victorian writers and journalists were fascinated by prostitutes, but rarely depicted them with humanity. In fiction, the fallen woman was a cautionary tale, a figure of ruin and regret. She was either redeemed through suffering or punished by death. Rarely was she seen as a complex human being. Charles Dickens wrote about prostitutes in his novels, though often in veiled terms. Nancy in Oliver Twist is one of the few sympathetic portrayals. Yet even she dies violently, as if to reaffirm that a woman like her cannot survive. Penny Dreadfuls, cheap serialized novels, thrived on lurid tales of sex, crime, and punishment. Brothels were depicted as dens of exotic sin. Readers were titillated by the debauchery but reassured by the inevitable downfall of the women involved. Newspapers reported on brothel raids or murders with a blend of moral judgment and voyeuristic detail. The victims' backgrounds were reduced to caricatures, drunken, promiscuous, known to police. These portrayals shaped public opinion. They dehumanized the women, justified their mistreatment, and allowed society to ignore the deeper systems of poverty and patriarchy that created them. Prostitutes who died in the Victorian era were rarely buried with dignity. Most had no family willing to claim them. Few had money for proper funerals. They were buried in mass graves, pauper pits, or burned in anonymous crematoriums. Many were never recorded at all. Their deaths were logged as unknown woman, unidentified, or under false names. There were no headstones, no ceremonies, no mourners. A few charitable organizations offered Christian burials to former prostitutes who died in reform homes. But even these came with moral conditions: repentance, obedience, proof of transformation. The irony is stark. Victorian England built monuments to generals, poets, and kings, yet the women whose bodies built a hidden economy were erased from the record. Their lives were considered shameful, their deaths inconsequential. Even today, few memorials exist for these women. They are ghosts in the history books, silent victims of an empire built on contradiction. Modern media has often romanticized Victorian brothels, dressing them in lace, candlelight, and forbidden desire. Television dramas, films, and novels depict sex workers as witty, empowered, and alluring. While some women did exert agency, these portrayals erased the systemic brutality most endured. Historians have criticized this whitewashing. By focusing on a handful of wealthy courtesans, the broader truth is obscured. The reality was not corsets and champagne. It was disease, starvation, coercion, and abandonment. Even well-meaning feminists have sometimes framed prostitution in the Victorian era as a form of early sexual liberation. But this narrative risks ignoring the violence, lack of consent, and utter desperation that defined most women's experiences. To honor their memory, the truth must be told unflinchingly. Religion cast a long and complicated shadow over the world of Victorian brothels. The Christian Church was both a source of condemnation and, sometimes, a place of attempted refuge. Clergymen regularly preached against the sins of the flesh. Prostitutes were held up as cautionary symbols of spiritual ruin. Sermons warned that these women led men to damnation and disease. Religious tracts were distributed on street corners, urging sex workers to repent or perish. Yet many of the men in the pews were also frequent visitors to the brothels. Some priests themselves were exposed as clients. The contradiction was rarely acknowledged. Moral outrage existed in the pulpit, but not always in practice. Charitable Christian missions did attempt to intervene. Groups like the Church Penitentiary Association and the Society for the Rescue of Young Women provided shelters, training programs, and religious counseling. Their goal was to reform the fallen and return them to purity. But their approach was often rigid and controlling. Women were required to abandon their former lives completely, renounce their sexuality, and submit to strict daily routines that included Bible study, silence, and servitude. Those who didn't conform were turned out. Redemption, it seemed, was conditional. As medicine advanced in the Victorian era, doctors and scientists took a growing interest in prostitution, not to help the women, but to study and contain them. The female body became a subject of medical scrutiny. Prostitutes were examined in hospitals, clinics, and classrooms. They were used to study venereal diseases, pelvic disorders, and mental illnesses. Doctors measured their skulls, recorded their facial features, and classified them as biologically inferior. Some medical texts of the time argued that prostitution was a result of degenerate stock or female hysteria. Others claimed it was inevitable, necessary to protect respectable women from men's uncontrollable urges. The woman herself was blamed, pathologized, or erased. Public health policies targeted women, not men. Under the Contagious Diseases Acts, prostitutes were forcibly inspected and confined. Male clients were never examined or punished. Even physicians who decried the conditions of prostitution rarely challenged the medicine became a tool of regulation, not liberation. It labeled, restrained, and legitimized a hierarchy that reduced women to diseased objects in need of control. Though the Victorian brothels have long vanished, the systems that built and sustained them persist. The language has changed. The clothes are different. But around the world, women and girls continue to be trafficked, exploited, and silenced. In many countries, sex workers still face criminalization, police abuse, and stigma. They are still punished for surviving in systems that give them few alternatives. Modern human trafficking networks often mirror those of the 19th century, complete with false job promises, coerced labor, and brutal enforcement. Drug addiction remains a tactic of control. Legal protections are inconsistent or non-existent. Some progress has been made. Sex worker advocacy groups now fight for rights, recognition, and safety. There is a growing understanding that moral judgment has no place in policy. But deep-rooted biases persist. Society still struggles to reconcile agency and exploitation, survival and consent. The Victorian brothel may be gone, but its legacy lingers, in law, in language, and in the treatment of those who sell sex today. Official histories of the Victorian era have long overlooked the brothel. Biographies of statesmen, industrialists, and monarchs rarely mention the women who served them in secret. Museums seldom display their artifacts. Schoolbooks do not speak their names. The silence is deliberate. It protects reputations. It sanitizes the past. It allows myths of progress and morality to flourish unchecked. But the cost of that silence is immense. It erases millions of lives. It conceals the brutality behind empire, the suffering beneath reform. It makes it easier to repeat mistakes, to ignore warning signs, to blame the victim instead of the system. Recovering these histories requires discomfort. It demands honesty. It calls for the acknowledgement that the greatness of a nation cannot be measured by its inventions, art, or empire, if it forgets the women crushed beneath its weight.